Here we are. So our webinar is on. Welcome everyone at 6 p.m. as promised. We are very punctual and we will be starting a beautiful webinar. I will let you know in a few seconds a little bit more. Until that, welcome everyone. I see you just entering the room, which is great. Welcome everyone. And yeah, so while you're coming in, I will be explaining a little bit of technicalities before I introduce our wonderful guest of today, for today. So we are here in the Zoom environment, which gives us a lot of possibilities. So basically you are for now muted and you will stay muted as guests. You have the availability and possibility to, of course, watch the webinar and be very active in the chat. The chat you will find on the right side of your screen. Basically, how you get there, you need to go on the lower part of your screen and there is something with the name chat on it. Just click on it and the right bar should be visible for you. So basically, if you want to write something, you should be able to do it. So if you have questions, just feel free to write your question in the webinar. I will be moderating it and I will be giving our guest signals and signs if there are any questions. So please feel free to comment, to write. So I'm writing now hello everyone so you can see it. And it's important that you put your questions to all of us. That means all the discussion, all the panelists and all the members. So here you should be able to see a message already. So while I'm talking, please write, let us know where you are writing or where you are connecting from. So where are you based basically right now? Let us know who you are. And let us also know what is your job? What is your job title? What is your position? And the third one is a warm up. How do you feel? With one word only. Let us know how you feel. So where you're from, what is your position, what is your job, and how you feel in one word only. That's like this very nice warm up. Okay, and I think that's about technicalities. I will be writing it in the chat in the moment. This question will appear there as well, so you have the possibility to write them. And what I will say, I would say I'm very happy that I'm here and that I have this beautiful guest, Tamara Thorpe, today with us in our IFID webinar series. So I'm grateful to Tamara that she can come regardless all this craziness out there. And I'm also grateful to you guys, to everyone, that you take the time and space to be here with us. So Tamara, may I introduce you? So Tamara is a leadership and organizational excellence strategist and a global leadership expert. And she supports leaders and organizations understand culture. So she has taken her business and brand global with businesses in the USA or US and in Ireland. That's very, that's fantastic. That's really, really cross-culture, intercultural. And Tamara has also a wide and great experience, over 20, I guess, if I'm not wrong, if it's, I hope I'm right. So it's like 20 years experience in the intercultural field. So I'm very, very happy to welcome you, Tamara.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
Fantastic. So we are very curious about the webinar and about the title, How to Create the Culture of Belonging. Before we start, Tamara, let me know how you're doing. I mean, this is a special time out there.
It is. It's an incredibly unique and unusual time. We chatted earlier, you know, as an entrepreneur who has been working from home for the last 15 years, the initial transition was pretty easy because not a lot changed. But I certainly have noticed as I have as this has gone on longer and I've interacted more with my clients and my community and my network and friendships and just going out and about, I'm noticing a little bit more anxiety and stress, both in myself and those around me. So I'm really just trying to pay attention to how I'm feeling, how others are feeling, and also, you know, have things that I can focus on and engage in, so that we don't get too stuck in what isn't possible, but also pay attention to the stress.
So what I'm hearing is just like taking care of yourself, taking care of how we are internally, and also looking outside, but more like focusing on what does good to me and how can I move on with this. Yeah, a little bit different situation.
Yeah,
right?
I think, you know, it's very easy to feel stuck.
Yeah.
And I know also a lot of people are feeling pressure to kind of be productive and move forward. And I think that there's maybe a happy medium between feeling stuck and being overly productive, right? Where we're able to self-monitor, self-regulate, and because, you know, I'm finding new sparks of creativity. I have, you know, projects and things that I have to adjust and adapt, and part of that is exciting for me as an entrepreneur. You know, change and pivoting is kind of where we get excited.
Yes.
But at the same time, you know, recognize that it's really, you know, stressful to engage in a lot of change and to, you know, be out in the world today and do the things that we need to do. So trying to find that happy space in the middle.
Beautifully said. I take it with me. And yeah, let me know also, you, everyone else who is in with us in the chat, how do you feel about the situation? So here we have people, Tamara, just to let you know, we have people from Hong Kong, from Seoul, from Canada, Edmonton, from Mexico, Morocco, Dutch living in Canada. So we are quite very international, not quite, it's like too little, very international today.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
great, we manage besides what's happening. So what I would suggest, I would just mute myself and also disappear to give you all the place and the space that is needed for this beautiful webinar, and I will just pop in and out, and I will be with our guests in the chat, navigating there a little bit.
Fantastic. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Tamara. See you soon.
Bye. Okay, so again, welcome everybody, and thank you, Barbara, for the invitation to be a part of this webinar, and thank you to all of you who are attending from all your different parts in the world. As Barbara said, I'm based in Dublin, Ireland, and I've been here for just about 3 years. I'm from the United States. And so I do my work both in the United States and within Europe from my base here in Ireland. And a lot of my work in the intercultural field has been around leadership development and helping leaders understand difference within their organizations, and how to lead across difference. And so that has been with helping organizations with different culture groups, different nationalities, different populations, different generational cohorts, and really helping leaders develop the cultural competence that they need to be able to lead across those. And in the work that I have been doing, I have noticed that, particularly with organizations, that there are a lot of things that organizations are doing really well. And then I think there are also some areas where organizations struggle. And I think that belonging and fostering belonging in the workplace is an opportunity for organizations and leaders to really shore up their diversity and inclusion programs, as well as really support the engagement and retention of their diverse talent. And so today I want to dive into a little bit about what that process has been, for me in terms of what is the connection between diversity and inclusion and belonging, and what are some of the barriers that have gotten in the way from organizations really taking this next step to fostering inclusion by creating cultures of belonging. And then how can leaders within organizations think more critically about the culture within their organizations, and how then within those cultures to make them a place, a safe place for people who are not part of the dominant culture or majority group. So that's kind of where we're headed today. And I also want to leave some opportunity for discussion and questions and answers at the end, because I really would like to hear from some of you or all of you. And also, I'm going to probably make a couple of adjustments also, because now one of the things that we're talking about is how leaders can do this when their teams might now be working from home. And I think that this is something that's really important, because I do a lot of work with virtual and remote teams. And so it certainly is relevant. And I think it's more relevant now than ever, because people who aren't used to working from home, who are feeling disconnected from friends and family, can also be feeling disconnected from their work and their coworkers. And so I think that it's relevant, and I want to make sure that we address that and make those connections as well. So let's start with talking about why this is important. Belonging is really important because a single instance of being excluded can really undermine one person's own sense of self. And when we look at what makes people engaged in their work and feel connected to their teams and their organizations, it's really important that they feel included and have a sense of belonging. And when they don't have that, we know then that employees use a lot of different strategies. So employees who do not feel a sense of belonging take more sick days, they underperform, and very often they leave organizations. And so one of the things that I hear from organizations, and is really supported in the research, is that organizations are really losing millions of dollars in payouts for annual sick leave, low job performance, and employee turnover. And I've done a lot of work, particularly in the last few years, helping organizations with their multi-generational teams and leveraging millennial talent. And now we're looking at Gen Z talent coming into the workplace. And there have been really critical retention issues with younger talent. And a lot of that comes from them feeling excluded and as lacking a sense of belonging to the organization. And so you have organizations that are spending millions of dollars in diversity and inclusion strategies to build websites and policies that are inclusive. And yet somewhere those policies and practices are falling short. And I think that one of the areas where they are falling short and can make up the difference is in the culture of the organization, and ensuring that the culture of the organization is one where people feel a strong sense of belonging. And that is, I think, one of the key elements that gets overlooked. So let's talk a little bit about, I want to talk a little bit about then how do we distinguish between diversity, inclusion, and belonging? Because very often these terms seem synonymous or ubiquitous because they get used a lot and thrown around a lot in organizations. And then, of course, very often we might see diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging, which I will talk about as well. But I think it's important that we understand both why these concepts and practices are important and how they differentiate from one another. So someone, Pat Waters, has described as diversity and inclusion may capture your head, but belonging captures your heart. If you, we reference Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that third level of need really is around belonging and connection to group. And so when organizations are coming up with their diversity and inclusion strategies, it's really important to think about how do we make sure that we're making that heart connection, that personal connection with our employees in such a way that they want to come to work, be productive, be a part of the team, because that's a lot of what is missing. And when we talk about millennial talent, for example, I think that's probably one of the biggest generational value differences between previous generations and the new generations that are coming in, is that for newer generations, that personal connection is vital to their retention. And without it, they're far less likely to stay within an organization. Tanya Mosley, who's a Stanford fellow, has said, diversity is a fact, inclusion is a practice, and equity is a goal. And I really love that phrase, and it's become rather popular. And I wanted to kind of build on what she has said, and I have added belonging to this, so that we can look at diversity as a fact, equity is the goal, and I think inclusion is a choice, particularly because when we're talking about organizations having to make changes around policy and practices, organizations can choose to do it or not to do it. And I think that it's something that is an important choice to make. And then I think belonging is a practice. This is something that gets built into the organizational culture and norms that really drives and informs how people interact and engage and treat one another. That very often, while it may be written in the mission statement, it may be written in the vision, it may be in the values, but very often it doesn't really play out in how people interact every day within the organization. And I think in order for diversity and inclusion to be successful, that belonging really has to be a practice that's built into how people within organizations interact and engage every day. So let's talk a little bit about then what each of these mean. So when we say diversity is a fact, I think it's important that we recognize that diversity is really about human differences, particularly group identity-based or demographic differences. So for me, the most important part of that definition is that every single person within an organization is part of what makes that organization diverse, because every human is different and every human belongs to a particular group. But very often there's this mindset in organizations that if we bring them and make them part of our organization, that's what makes our organization diverse. And what is difficult and how that is problematic is then everything that becomes then part of the diversity and inclusion strategy is only about the other people. And it puts all the burden and responsibility on that group to adjust, adapt, and fit in. But if everybody in the organization, even the dominant group, recognize that they are part of the definition of diversity and what makes the organization diverse, then everybody has some buy-in to making sure that the inclusion and belonging strategies work. And I think that that is really, really vital to our understanding, is that every single person within it is part of the definition of diversity. And the truth is that organizations, communities, teams, society is diverse. That's a fact, right? I live here in Ireland, and people can you know, the days of Ireland being a monocultural society are over. It is an incredibly diverse country now, where we have um, uh, cultural groups from all over the world, and there are lots of different identities, whether it's around age, gender, sexual identity, gender, ability, that all of these things are what make us diverse, both within our organizations and our community and our family. And I think everybody the last couple of weeks has been discovering how diverse your family is. And so I think that when we think about what diversity means, that if we start with understanding that it is a fact and it is something that we are all a part of, that this is an important mindset to have when we talk about diversity and inclusion. The other part of the definition around terminology around equity being a goal is understanding that equity and equality are not the same thing. And so this idea that if we provide the same solution to everybody and everybody has something that's equal, then the solution has been fair. But very often, what is going to be a solution for one is not a solution for the other. So the idea is we want everybody to be in a fair position, but how everybody gets there might be different. And that's really the difference between equity and equality. And I think that, again, that's an important distinction, because organizations will have a tendency to implement a policy across the board so we make it fair for everyone. But in reality, it may not be a solution that other people need. So just here in this imagery you see, right, is giving everybody the same size box doesn't necessarily mean everybody ends up in the same place. Some people are going to need a different solution, a higher box or a smaller box. And so I think that that is something and a distinction that's really important to make when we're trying to identify how we're making policies and practices within organizations. And inclusion as a choice. So inclusion, there's lots of, recently I've seen a lot of memes on social media about, you know, diversity is, you know, inviting people to the table, or inclusion's asking them to dance, or something like that. There's sort of an array of those that are out there. But I think that this quote here from Amanda Bonilla is really relevant around inclusion is spending time understanding those differences and being intentional about creating policies and practices that embrace diversity. Inclusion is also being willing to listen to diverse perspectives and change the way a company does things. And so maybe that's inviting people to dance or to whatever the metaphors are. But I think that, again, this is about next steps, right? So if you've had successful recruitment and been able to bring in diverse talent that is different from the dominant culture group, whether it's age, gender, culture, etc., that it's then important for the dominant culture and the leaders of the organization to really start listening and to really start to understand what it is that makes us all different. For a lot of us who are intercultural practitioners, that we do a lot of study on difference. I think that that even within that context, we often sometimes overlook the different identities and how they make us different, and then what that looks like in terms of policies and practices within the organization. And then, of course, belonging as a practice. And belonging is a human emotional need to be accepted by a member of to be accepted as a member of a group, And as I referenced earlier in Maslow's hierarchy, that this is a really important part in how people develop self-esteem and self-actualization. And without having this sense of belonging, people can't achieve those higher levels. And so it really is a need that people have. And in order for organizations to be successful, it really has to be built into the practices and the culture of the organization. So I'm going to actually take a moment here to pause. And if anybody has any questions about diversity, equity, inclusion, or belonging, if you can throw that into the chat so I can take a bit of a breath, and if you need any clarity, then now would be the time to ask. Otherwise, I will proceed.
I'm monitoring the chat, Tamara, and I bet there will be questions. Not there yet, but yeah, all the participants feel free to just place them in the chat box.
Okay, I will proceed. And if questions come up, Barbara, just poke me and I will stop.
Will do.
Okay. So I want to talk about dominant culture. So this is a term that we use in the intercultural field a lot to talk about the majority group and or the dominant culture, because very often, even though there might be a group that is a majority, they may not be the dominant culture. But the research has shown that the dominant culture of within a society is what influences an organization's culture, policies, and practices. And within North America and Europe, this is a predominantly white normative culture in our society that then influences our organizations. And and I am part of lots of international organizations that were founded in the US or founded in Europe, and they've now expanded outside those regions. And countries that come from outside those regions really have to adapt and adjust to how we run our organization in a very either North American or European way. And that's because that is the dominant societal culture, and it ends up becoming the dominant culture within the organization that influences its policies and practices. And I like to give the example here in Ireland, for example, that socializing after work in pubs is a cultural norm. It's part of Irish culture, and it is part of a lot of the US businesses that come here have easily adopted that. And so for people who are working in organizations within Ireland, there are a lot of opportunities to go to the pub after work. But if for cultural reasons or personal reasons you don't drink, this kind of creates this barrier where there's a level of social engagement and networking within an organization that happens in this environment that other people may not have access to or have to access in a way that goes against their own values. And when we accept whiteness as the invisible norm, differences are ignored and white people and their assumptions are empowered, right? So if organizations are unable to see how the dominant culture, and in our European and North American context, that being the white normative culture, influences policy and practices, then those practices get empowered. And I think one of the we also have to recognize that not only in these regions is it white, but that it's also cis, it's hetero, it's male, it's middle-aged, it's Christian, and it's able-bodied and minded normative that really influences the culture of organizations. And so when people say, well, you know, we've recruited women, we've recruited millennials, we've recruited people of color, we've recruited people with different abilities, but they don't fit in, right? What they're being asked to fit into is this white, cis, hetero, male, middle-aged Christian, able-bodied, able-minded normative. And it's important that in order to foster belonging, that the expectation isn't that people will come from different identities and, you know, mold themselves into this normative. What needs to happen is for us to challenge these normatives and look at how organizations can shift their policies and practices so that people who are different can fit in without having to change their own identity. So let me talk a little bit more about how that shows up in organizations. So I gave the example, right, around socializing around food and alcohol. And certainly other cultures do this. But again, if people for personal reasons or cultural reasons don't drink alcohol, this becomes a prohibitive activity. Also, I think everybody probably knows someone who's vegan, and you know because they've told you. But for people who are vegan or vegetarian or have religious dietary restrictions, this comes up for them all the time when their companies have events or when they go to networking events, etc., about whether or not there have been, you know, their dietary needs are being met. Also, something that we see in North America and Europe is that, you know, Christian holidays are state sanctioned, and non-Christian holidays, people who are not Christian, in order to have their holidays off, very often they have to take their own personal leave, or, you know, they have to, you know, be willing to be on call, or may feel pressured to work because everybody else is at work, right? So they might be the only one who's not at work because they're practicing a different holiday. And of course, this comes up with people who are able-bodied, that so much of our policies and practices within the organization are really built around people being able-bodied and minded. And so I think many of us have had the experience of going to a building and there being no wheelchair access, and or, you know, or it's broken. I know I live in Dublin, and we talk all the time about how difficult it would be for people who are in any way have limited mobility just to get around the city. Very often, I know there are a few people here in HR, and I wonder if how many people who are working in organizations, particularly in HR, have policies and practice already in place to interview people who are deaf or blind. Again, when we think about how organizations recruit and onboard talent, we often anticipate that everybody who's applying is going to be able-bodied, and that often isn't taken into account. And I think one of the more interesting things that emerged when the stay-at-home order was put into place for most European countries and in North America was an immediate response of frustration from the community of people living with disabilities who have been turned away from jobs or denied the ability to work from home by organizations, who were really quite frustrated that with Force 2, organizations found a way for all their employees to work from home where people who have asked for that because of their limited ability have been denied either the ability to work from home or denied a job altogether. And so I think that that is a really important uh, complaint or observation for us to acknowledge when we look at how our organizations shaping their policies and practices in ways that people feel that they belong. And I think for a lot of organizations who, a lot of people, I saw the pain and frustration that people coming from the community of people living with disabilities were feeling, that now all of a sudden that able-bodied people had to work from home, organizations could adapt and flex. And so I think that's really, one of the things that's at the core of this, that organizations often don't change until they're forced. And what is important or useful and valuable about fostering belonging is that this is something that organizations do all the time. And if you're able to do this all the time, then down the road, you don't have to problem solve and make exemptions because it's already built into how the organization is run. And I think that that's vital. There was a research done by a team in the Netherlands of Muslim employees from Morocco who, each practiced their religion in different ways. So they were in the research participants were within different organizations. Each practiced their faith in different ways, some more traditional, some less. And in that research, they looked at how did these people within their organizations navigate and negotiate their way through policies that don't fit their cultural and religious practices. And they found that there were 3 sort of basic strategies that employees applied when the organization's cultural practices were not a fit for their culture. And one of them was adapting and negotiating. So for example, we use the pub example. So in some cases, people went to the pub and they just didn't drink, right? One of the things I hear from Muslim employees here in Ireland, in Dublin, who have worked in tech, is feeling really stuck in their roles because they don't go to the pub, they don't socialize, they don't get those mentoring and build those relationships with managers and leaders, that they feel as though they're never going to be promoted within the organization. So people who don't want to be excluded, who don't want to be left out, end up going into a social environment that may conflict with their values or their lifestyle. And so this is what in the research they called sort of adapt and negotiating, right? Well, I'll go to the pub, but I won't drink. And again, it may be a strategy that works for some time, but here you have somebody who is in a minority position having to really find ways to fit in, and that only reinforces that they do not belong. Another strategy that they would use is to avoid, right? So I don't want to put myself in that position. This is too uncomfortable. So I'm not going to go to the pub at all. And so when they skip out on that, as I said, they end up not being able to build those relationships with their coworkers, not have opportunities to be mentored by managers and develop those relationships. And then a third strategy that employees asked was what they refer to as rejecting and resisting, where people go to management and say, hey, this isn't working. Are there any alternatives? And in some cases, this can be a very successful strategy. It's bringing awareness to management, and management may say, wow, that was something we never thought of. We should find other ways to socialize and network in a way in which everybody can be included. But it also runs the risk of that person or people with similar identities being identified as, troublemakers or agitators or people who complain all the time. And so each of these strategies really runs a risk of the people who are not part of the dominant culture or majority group really feeling excluded. And if an organization from the top levels believes that the organization is committed to inclusion and committed to retaining and engaging their talent and creating an inclusive workplace, then it is their responsibility to ensure that people feel included and belonging. It is really not up to individuals in an organization to create their own sense of belonging. This is a leadership top-down responsibility. So one of the things that we then talk about, so then what can organizations do? And I think that it's really important that organizations really start looking at how whiteness shows up in their organizations, because when we look at how whiteness is influencing our policy and practices, it can then help organizations better understand what is going on in their organization and how to create change. So 5 good practices for interrogating whiteness within the organization so that you can foster belonging for all genders, sexual identities, ages, nationalities, ethnicities, religion, and differently abled people in the workforce is to be aware of the influence of the white normative within the workplace. How is it showing up in our interactions, in our policies, in our practices? How does it show up, and how might it be coming into conflict with people who are different from that? And then also acknowledge its power, right? It is such a, it becomes such a norm, and what is norm or normal has a lot of power. So being aware of its influence and acknowledging the power are really important. And then start to challenge our assumptions. Why do we assume that everybody applying for a job is able-bodied? Why do we assume that people who come from different cultural backgrounds are going to behave a certain way? One of the complaints that or feedback or input I get from a lot of people here at Human Resources in Dublin is resumes being rejected if the names are not of Irish descent, right? And so there's this assumption that if the name is foreign, that they are foreign, and if they're foreign, that they won't fit in, or they won't speak English, or they won't be a fit. And there's just a lot of assumptions tied into that. And I think that it's really important to be able to challenge the assumptions that are being made within an organization. And then, of course, to create alternatives, right? If we're not going to the pub every day, what are we doing? What are things that we as an organization can do that allow us to socialize informally, connect with one another, have informal conversations? Because those things are really important, and there's lots of different ways that it can happen. I was on a panel with a woman who, with her organization, they had a huge brainstorming session with everybody, and they said, what are all the different ways in which we can socialize in a way that includes everybody, that everybody would enjoy? And she said they came up with a phenomenal list. I was also in another panel, and there was a woman who was talking about how they have offices in 5 different parts of the world, and each office is chosen based upon where they are and what's of interest in the world they are, on how they socialize with one another. So I think it's important that organizations really be creative. And then, of course, this takes practice. There's no way to do this once and get it right. This is in a lot of ways messy, difficult, challenging work, um, and um, and has to be kind of a step-by-step process that um, you know, organizations do knowing that you're going to make some mistakes. And that's why listening and being inclusive in this process is so important, because there's so much for people to be learning from one another to find a way to create policies and practices that are a fit for everyone. So I used the example before. I'm not sure. When I was a kid, we had this toy. It was a, a, a ball that you put different shapes into, right? So if you think about organizations as a ball with different shapes, right? It could be a ball, and upon the ball, all the shapes on it are squares, and you've got to put a square block through each of those holes to get all the square blocks into the hole. Then that's a pretty easy thing to do. But in reality, all the shapes outside of the ball are different size shapes. And if you expect the star shape and the moon shape and the round shape to go through a square, it's not going to fit. And you're going to have to bend and smush and twist that circle, moon, or star to fit into that square till it doesn't really want to fit in anymore. So organizations, if organizations can envision themselves as the ball that creates a shape, so that you have a shape that the moon can fit into, you have a shape that the star can fit into, and there's a way for everybody to fit into the organization. I think that this is where, when we talk about creating alternatives, what we're talking about is finding a way for all the different shapes to fit into the ball without having to change their shape. I hope that metaphor makes sense. I should probably have had a picture of it on my slide. It might have been more helpful. But it's such a clear image in my head from this childhood toy that I had. You know, it's sort of, you know, we use the expression trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You just can't do it. And so it means that you might have to have a star-shaped hole and a triangle hole and a half moon hole that allows everybody to find their way to fit into the organization. I think that's the real beauty of diversity. I think for people in the intercultural field, that's why we do what we do. And I think that's the challenge for organizations, to create cultures within their organization that are inclusive, where people belong, because they're not quite sure how to change from a square to a circle or a half moon. And so that's part of the work, and that's difficult work. And so with that being said, I think that there are 5 what I'm calling core truths about diversity and inclusion that I think really need to be reinforced, because I think organizations have, with the best of intentions, done a lot of research, reading, training, etc., on diversity and inclusion, and in that have come out with some misconceptions about what diversity and inclusion really is. And I think and those misconceptions become a barrier. And so these are what I'm saying are the 5 core truths that I think will help leaders and organizations really understand diversity and inclusion in a new way that allows them to think about being inclusive and fostering belonging in a new way. So the first truth is that diversity is about you. There's this misconception that it's about them, right? I was in a workshop about a month ago, and there was a gentleman who's a leader in an organization. He said, well, you know, I'm not part of the diversity, so, you know, it doesn't really affect me, right? And it's that kind of thinking that makes it someone else's problem, someone else's issue. And I think it's so important that everybody in the organization understands that diversity is about all of us. Each of us come to the table with our own unique qualities and identities that make us different from the other person. So we're all part of that diversity landscape. There's also this misconception that, you know, we have diversity training because some people are just so sensitive that we have to find ways to tiptoe around them because they are just easily offended. The truth is that sensitivity is a strength. And if leaders and organizations can become more sensitive to difference, it's a really powerful thing. I like to compare it like to a radar. So if you think of like a submarine that has a radar, and that radar's job is to gather information to help that submarine navigate under dark waters. And in that case, you want that radar to be as sensitive as possible, because the more sensitive that radar is, the more information they gather and the better they are able to guide in dark waters. And I think this is the exact same way that leaders within organizations want to be as sensitive as possible, because that is going to give them so much information about their team and the people they lead that's really going to help them lead and navigate the challenges within their team so much more effectively. So sensitivity is a strength. There's also this misconception that if someone has a problem, that it's their problem. If they don't fit in, it's their problem. If they don't like the policy, it's their problem, right? It works for mostly everybody. So if it doesn't work for one person, then it's that one person's problem. But the truth is if it's a problem for one, it's a problem for all. I think you know, for those of you who are working from home with your families, if there's one person there who's having a bad day, it affects everybody. And it's important for everybody to acknowledge that and respond in order to have a successful solution. We have the expression in English that one bad apple spoils the whole barrel. I think that's the expression, or like a blueberry. Because one person who's unhappy can have a really big impact, and it affects everybody. And if an organization is truly committed to inclusion and creating a place where people belong, they have to create that for everybody, not just the majority. We can't be satisfied with the majority are happy. I think it's important to recognize that if we're talking about being inclusive, we have to recognize that a problem for one is a problem for all of us. If one person on the team isn't happy, all of us have to respond and find a way to ensure that that person feels connected to the team, the same way we do with our friends and family. The fourth one is that innovation really is essential. Organizations implement what I consider superficial practices. So very often I'll say to an organization, how do you support your international staff? And they'll say, oh, well, we do a quarterly potluck, and everybody's got to bring food from their culture. And then I say, well, have you provided any cultural adjustment training? And then they go, oh, no. So rather than providing them with the training and the coaching that they need to adjust and adapt to living in another culture, they have a potluck where, you know, they have an opportunity to show their foreignness that really becomes a burden, right? It's a way that it burdens the employee to show their culture. It burdens the employee to come up with food to feed the entire staff. And it doesn't really allow for fostering a deeper understanding of difference. And so I think that organizations need to be more strategic and more innovative in how they recognize and acknowledge difference within the organization, and to move beyond some of the more superficial practices and find things that are more innovative. And another misconception is that all of this is extra, right? That we will, we need to invest money in printers and computers and invest money in things that are going to see an immediate return on our investment. And then we can worry about people and personalities and all of this later. But the truth is, it's vital for organizations to get it right from the start. Most managers spend about 25% of their time managing conflict within their organizations, which is a huge financial loss. Most organizations, for example, in the US, if someone files a complaint with human resources because they believe they've been mistreated, that just the cost for processing one complaint can cost up to $75,000 in human hours to process a complaint from beginning to end. And then we know that organizations, if you onboard talent and they leave within a year, that can cost an organization anywhere between $75,000 to $125,000 lost in the process of recruitment, retention, recruitment and onboarding, and then having to search and find a new employee. So it is really expensive to not get this right from the start. So it's important that organizations are investing early and quickly in ensuring that they are able to have within their organization practices that are inclusive and foster belonging in the workplace. And this may mean training, this may mean investing in mentor programs, this may mean investing in retreats, coaching. There's lots of different ways in which organizations can be investing, but investing in this early on is really essential. And so I think that if organizations can accept these 5 core truths and apply them with these 5 good practices, that it will then really put them in a place where they are going to be able to foster inclusion and create cultures of belonging within the workplace that really allow for their programs to succeed. So that is it for my formal presentation. And I will now invite Barbara to come back and take questions.
Yes, here I am. Tamara, thank you so much for the beautiful contribution for this amazingly informative webinar. And to you now, all participants, we have space for question and answers. So that's your time. Me, myself, I have also some questions because it was so nice. But just to let you know, I'm here, I'm collecting the questions. And while I do so, I will just say, Tamara, it was amazing. I really love the metaphor you have been using. And actually, what I recognize that. I recognize this toy, you know, where you need to pull this different shapes and different openings, different forms. And I have to say, it cost me, like, it made me smile because I had troubles with that when I was young. So I was trying to pull, you know, like a star into the moon shape. It was really amazing, hilarious actually. But then combined with what you said, that employees apply, or like they have these 3 strategies. You know, when you are a star and you're in the company and in your organization, and then you need to fit somewhere where it's not possible to fit, and that you just give up on yourself by adapting or negotiating your values. That's already like causing goosebumps on my, you know, like my skin. Or you know, like you go and you kind of pretend you are a star by not drinking this beer. That's like amazing. Or you avoid as a strategy. I mean, we have this business level, but this is very interpersonal, very like internally important level, right? Place to state, where am I, who am I, what is my value, how can I contribute not only to this organization but also to this whole world, and how does it shake me actually up when I do not fit into my working environment? How does it actually, what does it tell me about myself in my private area as well. So
yeah. And that's why that quote I shared at the beginning that said that, right, that a single act of exclusion can undermine self-control and well-being and creates pain and conflict. And then when the second quote I shared that said belonging is about capturing the heart, right? We're really talking about how people feel about themselves, right? We're not talking about, these sort of superficial exteriors about I can use a computer, I can't use a computer. We're really talking about people's own sense of self-worth and value, and that these experiences where you're being forced to fit into something and knowing that it's good, like if I'm a star, I'm never gonna be a square. I can try, but I'm always gonna have those bumpy edges. And it really does. That's what creates this kind of underlying tension. A few weeks ago, I was with an organization and they had read this article about people faking it in the workplace, right? And I think that people who are not part of the majority group or dominant culture are all faking it a little bit, right? Women are faking it a little bit. People of color are faking it a little bit. Everybody's faking it a little bit because they're being asked to be something they're not.
that's
And when you're faking it, you're not doing your best, right? Like people are, why aren't I getting the best out of my team? Because you're asking them to fake it.
That also brings me like it's like so amazing, because when you talk, I'm just imagining, okay, I'm faking it even a little bit. That means I cannot be myself. That means that what I'm doing is exhausting me. What it means, I come back home and I'm exhausted and I don't have any time, any space, any like anything to hold on to the good feeling. I'm just like, and it's like a repetitive, constant mental case already, mental health case, and that's it's incredible. I mean, this is such an important topic. I mean, I would have one more question, but I look here, I will have a look in the chat, and I have a question from, I hope I pronounced the name right, Lucienne misschien, maybe. What's the name of the study from the Netherlands? It sounds very interesting.
I think of what I can do is I will put the sources that I referenced on the PowerPoint on an additional slide, and they will be in there. But it was a phenomenal study. I was really impressed, and it is, it speaks to these ways in which all the stars and square and moons and circles try to fit in. But yes, I will put the name of the resources that I used on a slide so that then they'll be available on the website.
Thank you so much. That's definitely incredible, also for our guests who were already asking if the presentation will be available. And also Miriam was saying that she never encountered regulations or policies, as you said, like regulations for people who are blind or who are deaf in their working place, right? So that also gives us
a few. In the last year, there was a documentary about people from Ireland who have disabilities who were moving to the UK because more businesses in the UK had access for them to get jobs. And they highlighted particularly a case with H&M where the candidate indicated in their application that they were deaf, and they got an immediate response that there would be an interpreter at the interview. And that person was hired, has moved up through the different levels, and they kind of walked through the different ways in which H&M provides them with the tools they need to be able to be deaf and manage a store in a speaking world. And I think that is just, and again, one of these things that when I said it's not just the white normative, right? But it's also very cis, and it's very hetero, and it's very male, and it's very able-bodied, because organizations think, oh, we have a friend of mine, works for a tech company, and he was bragging, we have these hiring parties, and we invite all the applicants to come, and we can kind of socialize informally and get to know people. And I said, well, what if one of the candidates was blind? Like, how would they interact in this kind of setting, right? And it never occurred to me. And it's like, well, you're talking about a tech job. There are lots of people who are disabled that do jobs from behind a computer because it's something a way in which they can access work. And I said, tech companies should be thinking about this far more critically. And I mean, people with with disabilities have the highest rate of unemployment in almost every society globally.
This is incredible. Miriam is just stating that it's probably partly because I used to work in petrochemical industry. So they are lagging behind, I think, in accepting people who are not fully body abled. I think, I think this regulation about deaf and blind people is really incredible. I mean, when we really want to talk diversity, and when we want to talk equity, right?
Yes.
This is where we should focus upon. And I also love this picture. It's like such a beautiful visual. You're touching me. It's like incredible visual tool to just kind of help us as individuals, but also like leaders in companies, to embrace this fact that not everyone needs the same things, and it goes for women, for men, for color, for everything. That's incredible.
Yeah. I think that that's an important, that and again, this isn't about vilifying organizations that don't do it, right? When what is normal to all of us is blinding, right? When we think about what is normal in my, I always tell people, it's like when I got married, right? Is that you think, oh, my family's normal, and then you get married and you're like, oh my God, their family's not normal. Maybe my family's not normal, right? And so then all of a sudden you start to question, okay, what is a normal family? There is no normal family, right? Because what is normal to you can become really blinding to see someone else's normal, right? And so when organizations are just like people, we don't know what we don't know. So this is about being able to say, this might be a blind spot, and here's how you can tackle this by really starting to ask yourself, what are our organizational norms and what is informing them, right? What part of our society, good and bad, is informing what we do? So when it comes, for example, to millennial talent, organizations, when I've been working with organizations who are struggling to retain their millennial talent, they're like, well, what are we supposed to give them? Ping pong tables and bean bags?
Yes.
And it's like, no, how about if you just listen to their ideas and not tell them that they are too young to know better, right? And they were like, well, but they are too young. They don't know. And I was like, well, that's the problem, because you think they don't know anything, and you tell them you think they don't know anything. So why would they want to work in your company, right? You can have all the ping pong tables, all the bean bags you want, but if you tell your talent that they're not valuable, then that's the message, and they will go find somewhere where they're valuable, where they're valued, where they're recognized, where they feel that they belong. And I think that is the challenge, right? It's like, we can't think so simplistically about this, right? But there's this, right? It's that middle-aged norm that, you only really know things till you're 35, right? Or 45, right? And the truth is that I meet 5-year-olds that change my whole way of thinking, right? And when you are recruiting talent that has invested 4, 5, 8 years in education, and you bring them into the company and then tell them they have to wait another 10 years for their ideas to matter, it makes zero sense, right? And so I think it's really recognizing, and the same happens for people who are older. In the US, they did a report, and that people over 55 are experience lots of age discrimination, both when they're in organizations and in the hiring process. Because we think, oh, people are too old. Oh, they're too old. What do they know, right? And so, that's when I said it's also this middle-aged norm. But we think, oh, if people between 35 and 55, they're the ones that know everything, and everybody else is too young or too old, and they're irrelevant. And that is a horrible way to treat people.
It is incredible. So this normative culture in that sense, the middle-aged culture,
yeah.
It's incredible.
And it's important to recognize that. And again, people aren't, I think 98% of organizations aren't doing this on purpose, right?
Yeah.
But if you are told that it can be better and how it can be better, and you don't do anything about it, then maybe that's the problem.
Well, that's nicely said, right? And I will just lead it to, because it fits perfectly. There is a question from Luzine, I apologize if I do not spell it correctly. I hope I do. Are there organizations that help support companies in the policies and practices for creating that culture of belonging, like how a diversity officer at some universities could work?
So there's companies like mine that help organizations with that. And I think in different parts of the world, there are different organizations and practitioners that focus on inclusion and belonging. I think that it's interesting for me as an American to see, who's lived in different parts of the world, to see where different parts of the world are in this process, right? Because the United States has been talking about diversity and inclusion for a very long time. And I lived in Canada for 6 years, and I've now been here 3 years. And to see it, Ireland has only been a multicultural society for about 25 years. So the conversation around diversity and whiteness and racism is a very young conversation. So that there aren't necessarily a lot of resources in Ireland, but I think for every country, that there are specialists where they are, and of course, myself, and I know practitioners across Europe, and of course, within your work that do this work. But I think it is helpful for organizations to rely on people who know better, because we can't, it's very hard to see what you're not good at.
Yeah. So what we will do, definitely for our guests, we will upload the webinar with contact details of Tamara, so you can contact her directly if you need some guidance or need your questions to be answered. And that will be definitely something that you will find linked on our website. But this I will inform you in the email, so this is not going to disappear. Tamara, if you still can, I mean, that's you're talking so nicely, but it's like I know it's also a long time of of the conversation, but it's such an interesting topic. Like nowadays, we of course are challenged to face a little bit of a different type of belonging, I would say. What would you recommend? How to foster belonging in an online world? Like, is it something different than usual? Is it the same maybe?
Yeah, I think one of the things that the discussion has come up a lot about virtual etiquette, right? And how we behave in a virtual space. And there are a lot of norms within operating in a virtual space that are very white normative practices, right? Because most of these platforms have come out of North America or Europe. So like the raise hand feature, right? Raising your hand to speak is not necessarily something that people from all culture groups would do in a face-to-face environment, right?
Yeah.
And also for extroverts, for me, being a webinar attendee where I have to be silent as an extrovert for 30 to 45 minutes is really difficult, which is why as a facilitator, I always try to kind of stop and give space for people to speak, because it's so strange to not have that interaction for me as an extrovert. And so I think, yes, the same things have to apply. We have to think about, as leaders who are having meetings and events in a virtual space, what are things that we can build in that will be a fit for, you know, the diversity of the group. Zoom, for example, has a wonderful feature where people can be broken up into smaller groups. And I've done that. You know, we facilitated a 6-hour forum on discussion on race. And having those small breakout discussions was so important, because, you know, 20 people don't want to sit there and talk about race. It's a difficult conversation, but when you can put people in small groups and pairs, people really share one-to-one in a different way. So I think it's one, recognizing who your audience is and how you might use the technology to address those different personality styles, learning styles, cultures, etc. And I also think at a time when teams are disparate, that may be used to being in the same office together, that leaders really take the time to connect with people one-on-one. And then again, like, you know, when you and I came on, we had a chat, we checked in, we asked the group to check in, to not ignore that there's other stuff going on. I think that that's so important, and to give space for that relationship building and that checking in. I work on 2 remote teams, and for one of them, I have just in the last year, because it's a remote team, spent countless extra hours just having one-on-one conversations with people on my team. Because it just makes such a difference. So when we all came together for the first time for our face-to-face meeting, a lot of them didn't know each other, but a lot of them had had that connection with me. So I was really able to kind of know what was happening for the group and really help bridge and make connections for the entire team to really have a good bonding experience. And so, you know, we have Slack where we do business, and then we have a WhatsApp group where we check in and how is everybody doing, what's going on for you. And I think that is such an important thing. So I think continuing to foster the relationships, checking in. And I think that this old idea that people come to work in some sort of professional capacity where their human emotion is left at the door is such an old misconception that needs to just be completely ruled out, because you're a human being all the time. And when you walk into your work or when you get on that call, all of the feelings and emotions you have in your life are still part of who you are. And I think giving people space to be their full selves, like you said earlier, if I'm faking it, I'm not being my full self. And it's really draining to get on there and fake it. And to be able to say, you know, no, this isn't working for me, right? This stay-at-home order is stressful, and to give space for your team to have that conversation is, I think, really, really valuable.
Oh, thank you so much. It's amazing. I mean, I learned so much today. Even, you know, this WhatsApp and Slack treat it as, let's say, WhatsApp, the small talk area, and Slack or Zoom and whatever technical features you're using as the working area. So both, to connect both, it's just like having coffee before, right? Amazing. Tamara, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
It was great and amazing having you here. I asked in a group to share one word, or a word of how was the webinar of use for you. And Miriam was answering triggering. I wonder what the rest of the people will say. There will be a little bit of a poll coming, or like an evaluation form after the webinar, I hope. So I will be sharing it with you. We will be talking about it as well. And I would say thank you so much for today.
Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed every minute of it, and I'm glad we got to share, and hope that it was valuable for everybody.
It was gorgeous. So everybody, thank you so much for being here. And as I said, we will be sharing the webinar and also a freebie, which Tamara prepared especially for you. So it will be all made available. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you, and the details of Tamara to contact her are also available with the webinar. So having said that, I'm saying thank you one more time. Thank you to everyone, and seeing you soon, I hope.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.